On May 8th, 1878, the children of Bronislawa and Ladislaus Sklodowski gathered quietly around their mother's bed. She was gravely ill, her body weakened by tuberculosis, a disease that, at the time, had no real cure. Doctors could only recommend rest, clean air, and time spent in healing environments. Years earlier, she had even travelled to a spa in France, hoping to recover. But nothing had worked. Her youngest daughter, Maria, who the world would later know as Marie Curie, was only 10 years old when she watched her mother slowly fade away. Yet even before this tragedy, Maria's childhood had already been shaped by hardship. Poland, her homeland, was not free. It had been divided between powerful empires, and Warsaw, where the family lived, was under Russian control. Maria's father was a teacher of mathematics and physics, but working in a Russian-controlled school came with constant pressure. He had to follow strict rules, speak Russian, and hide his Polish identity. Any sign of resistance could cost him his job, or even his freedom. This atmosphere of fear deeply affected the children. At home, life was no easier. Because of her illness, Bronislawa kept a physical distance from Maria. She avoided hugging or kissing her, fearing she might pass on the disease. To a small child, this created confusion. Maria knew her mother loved her, but she could not understand why that love felt distant. This emotional gap would stay with her for years. Despite everything, Maria showed remarkable intelligence from an early age. She learned quickly, sometimes faster than those around her. Once, when her older sister struggled to read aloud, young Maria took the book and read the passage perfectly. Instead of pride, she felt guilt, as if her talent had caused harm. Her parents, too, were concerned. They wished she could simply be a child, playing and laughing, instead of standing out so early. Meanwhile, the family situation grew worse. Maria's father lost his position due to increasing Russian control over Polish institutions. To survive, he turned their home into a boarding house for students. The house became crowded and chaotic. It was in these difficult conditions that tragedy struck again. Maria's older sister, Zofia, fell ill with typhus and died at just 14 years old. Only 2 years later, their mother passed away. For Maria, the loss was devastating. In a short time, she'd lost both a sister and her mother. The home, once filled with structure and purpose, became quiet and heavy with grief. Her father withdrew into his work, and joy became rare. Yet even in sorrow, Maria continued her education. She attended schools where Polish culture was secretly preserved, despite Russian restrictions. Teachers and students worked together to hide forbidden subjects like Polish history. If inspectors arrived, books would vanish instantly, replaced with harmless lessons. Maria often had to answer questions in Russian during these inspections, a task that filled her with tension and frustration. Still, her abilities stood out. She excelled in languages, literature, mathematics, and science. Her father, despite limited resources, encouraged her curiosity. Though he had no laboratory, he inspired her love for scientific thinking, a passion that would later change the world. But emotionally, Maria carried a deep weight. After her mother's death, she began to question everything she once believed, including religion. The loss had left her with anger and doubt. At the same time, the strict and often cold environment of her new government school tested her resilience even further. And yet, through all of this, loss, fear, poverty, and pressure, Maria Sklodowska was quietly becoming someone extraordinary. Maria would never openly admit it, but she was starting to enjoy school. In a letter to her friend Kazia during a vacation, she finally confessed what she called her guilty secret. She liked school. In fact, she loved it. Learning excited her. At the same time, she and Kazia found ways to have fun, often playing small tricks on their teachers and classmates in the strict government school. But beneath this playful side, Maria lived under constant pressure. She feared the sudden arrival of Russian inspectors. She pushed herself to be the best in every subject, and deep inside, she was still grieving the loss of her mother and sister. Her emotions moved between extremes, moments of intense joy followed by periods of deep sadness. As she grew older, Maria became more aware of the situation in Poland. Instead of launching another dangerous rebellion, many Polish thinkers began to believe in a different path. They focused on strengthening the country quietly, through education, economic progress, and cultural survival. The idea was simple: build a strong foundation from within and wait for the right moment. Maria felt this struggle deeply. Yet despite everything, nothing could stop her academic success. In 1883, at just 15 years old, she graduated from her school at the top of her class. Like her older siblings before her, she received a gold medal. But all the pressure she had carried finally caught up with her. Years of hard work, combined with personal loss and the weight of her country's situation, left her exhausted. She needed a break. So she left Warsaw and travelled to the countryside. The journey itself revealed a different side of Poland. As she moved through the wide open plains, she saw both beauty and hardship. Poor farmers worked the land, sometimes without even proper shoes. Some had oxen to help them plough, but others had no choice but to push the heavy tools themselves. It was a harsh reality, but it deepened her connection to her homeland. Maria first stayed with her uncles, Henryk and Władysław Boguski. Though they were seen by some relatives as unreliable or unsuccessful, Maria found their home full of life. There were books, music, laughter, and interesting visitors. For her, it was a refreshing change. For the first time in a long while, she had no responsibilities, no pressure, no expectations. She wrote to Kasia that she was doing almost nothing. No serious studying, no real work. Sometimes she woke up early to walk through the woods. Other times, she slept late. She played games, read light novels, and simply enjoyed being carefree. Her sharp, disciplined mind seemed to rest. She even joked about her own laziness, saying she felt strangely happy doing nothing at all. Later that summer, Maria visited another uncle, Zdzislaw, who lived near the Carpathian Mountains. There, life became even more joyful. Surrounded by cousins and lively company, she experienced a world filled with music, laughter, and celebration. One of the highlights was a traditional winter event called a kulig, a mix of costumes, dancing, music, and sleigh rides. Maria was fascinated. The night was full of energy, elegant clothing, and dancing that lasted until morning. For a young girl who had known so much hardship, these moments felt magical. Even after returning to Warsaw, her year of rest continued. She spent time at a beautiful countryside estate with her sister, Helena. There, life felt almost like a dream. She learned to row, swam in clear waters, and spent her days freely, sleeping, dancing, and enjoying simple pleasures. It was a time of complete release. For a while, the pressures, the losses, and the struggles faded into the background. Maria laughed, explored, and lived without worry, something she had rarely been able to do before. But this peaceful chapter would not last forever. Soon, she would return to a path that would demand everything from her once again. After her peaceful year in the countryside, Maria had to return to reality. Back in Warsaw, life felt heavy again. Grey streets, limited opportunities, and a future that seemed frustratingly narrow. For a young Polish woman at that time, higher education was almost impossible. The system itself was designed to keep women out. Universities required knowledge of classical languages like Latin and Greek, but girls were never taught these subjects. It was a closed door. There was only one real option: leave Poland and study abroad. But that required money, something Maria's family, simply did not have. So, reluctantly, she chose a different path. She began working as a tutor while continuing to educate herself in every spare moment. Her father played a huge role in this. He was a disciplined, highly educated man who believed deeply in knowledge. Evenings at home often turned into discussions about literature, science, and ideas. In this environment, Maria made a quiet decision. If she could not attend a university, she would build her own education. During this time, she became involved in a powerful intellectual movement known as positivism. It emphasized science, reason, and practical progress. Instead of dreaming about revolution, it focused on strengthening society through education, industry, and knowledge. For Maria, this way of thinking made perfect sense. She began to believe that science was not just a subject, it was a way to improve the world. At the same time, she joined a secret network known as the Floating University. These were underground classes where young people, especially women, gathered to learn subjects that were forbidden under Russian rule. Here, ideas like science, philosophy, and even political theory were discussed freely. It was risky, but it kept their minds alive. Still, Maria and her sister Bronia wanted more. They dreamed of studying in Paris. But how? Together, they created a bold plan. Maria would work as a governess, live as cheaply as possible, and send money to support Bronia's medical studies in Paris. Once Bronia finished, she would help Maria do the same. It was a sacrifice, and Maria knew it would take years, but it was their only chance. Her first job as a governess was a disaster. The family she worked for wasted money on luxury, but refused to provide basic comforts. She described them as shallow, hypocritical, and impossible to live with. She quickly left. Her second position, with the Zurawski family, was better. The people were kind, and she found some stability. She spent long hours teaching the children, but she also used her free time for something much more meaningful. She secretly taught peasant children how to read and write. This was dangerous. Teaching Polish culture and language was forbidden under Russian rule. If caught, she could have been arrested or even sent to Siberia. But Maria continued anyway. What began as a small group of students quickly grew. For her, education was no longer just personal, it was a mission. Yet life was not easy. She often felt lonely and intellectually isolated. Many people around her seemed uninterested in the deeper questions that filled her mind. Then something unexpected happened. She fell in love. Kazimierz Zurawski, the son of the family, returned home from university. The two connected immediately. They shared ideas, conversations, and a growing bond, but his parents strongly opposed the relationship. To them, Maria was only a governess, an employee, not an equal. Despite his feelings, Kazimierz eventually gave in to his family's pressure. Maria was heartbroken. She felt humiliated, rejected, and deeply wounded. In her pain, she swore she would never fall in love again. Yet she stayed in the same house, continuing her work for more than a year, carrying that emotional burden every day. But even in heartbreak, she did not stop growing. At night, after long hours of teaching, she studied. Physics, mathematics, sociology, anything she could find. She pushed herself relentlessly, waking early, sleeping little, and feeding her mind with knowledge. Slowly, her path became clearer. Science would be her future. By 1889, things began to change. Her sister Bronia had completed her studies in Paris and was ready to help. For the first time, Maria saw a real chance to leave Poland. Before that moment came, she returned to Warsaw and spent time with her father. It was here that something truly important happened. For the first time in her life, Maria entered a laboratory. It was small and simple, but to her, it was a new world. She began performing experiments she had only read about before. Sometimes they failed, and she felt frustrated. But when they worked, she felt an overwhelming sense of excitement. In that quiet laboratory, Maria discovered something that would shape the rest of her life. She didn't just love science, she belonged in it. Maria did not remain in Warsaw only because she felt responsible for her father. It also seems that she wanted to give her relationship with Kazimierz one final chance. There is little clear information about what happened when they met again that summer, but whatever hopes she still had came to an end. The relationship was truly over. After that, Maria wrote once more to her sister Bronia and asked if the invitation to Paris still stood. Bronia replied warmly and told her she could still come. This time, Maria did not delay. She boarded the train to Paris and began the long journey west. She travelled in a fourth-class carriage, sitting on a folding chair surrounded by her luggage. The trip was slow, uncomfortable, and exhausting. After 3 difficult days, her train finally arrived at the Gare du Nord in Paris. Bronia was away in Poland at the time, so Maria was met by her brother-in-law, Kazimierz Dluski, who brought her to the family apartment. Soon afterward, he wrote to her father and reported that everything was going well. He said that Maria was working seriously, spending almost all of her time at the Sorbonne, and appearing at home mainly for the evening meal. Yet beneath this polite report, he also hinted at irritation. He complained that Maria was unusually independent and did not seem willing to submit to his authority, despite the fact that her father had formally placed her under his care. By now, Maria had begun to use the French form of her name, becoming Marie. Life in the Dluski household quickly became difficult for her. Her brother-in-law was sociable, energetic, and liked to keep people around him. He enjoyed conversation, visitors, and a lively home. Bronia was naturally suited to this world and happily played the role of hostess. But Marie was very different. She had not come to Paris for social life. She had come to study. Even though she enjoyed some of the people who visited the house, including musicians, scientists, and Polish political activists, she felt that every evening spent on conversation, theatre, or concerts was time stolen from her education. Before long, Kazimierz began to wear on her nerves. Although he assured her father that they were living together in perfect harmony, Marie privately complained that he interrupted her constantly and seemed to want her to spend her time making pleasant conversation instead of working. For someone who had dreamed for years of studying in Paris, this was unbearable. The home was even more distracting because Kazimierz, now working as a doctor, also saw patients there. The apartment was busy, noisy, and full of movement. Marie soon decided that if she truly wanted to succeed, she had to leave. Using the practical excuse that she needed to live closer to the university, she rented a tiny attic room and moved out. For many people, this would have been a lonely step. But for Marie, it was a liberation. She loved being alone because it gave her total control over her life. She could organize every hour exactly as she wished. She could study when she wanted, rest when she wanted, and answer to no one. Yet this freedom came at a price. By leaving the Dluski home, she gave up free room and board. Now she had to survive on a very small amount of money, her own limited savings, and the occasional small sums her father sent from Poland. She settled in the Latin Quarter near the university where many poor students lived. Her own circumstances were extremely harsh, even by student standards. Her room was on the top floor, 6 flights up, and it had almost nothing in it. There was no heat, no proper lighting, and no running water. If she wanted water even for a cup of tea, she had to carry it in a pitcher from the landing. Her furniture was little more than the bare essentials. A mattress she had brought from Poland, a folding iron bed, a plain white wooden table, and a kitchen chair. She had a small stove for warmth and a petroleum lamp for reading at night. Marie had never really learned how to cook, and now that mattered. She was too poor to eat in restaurants, and did not know how to prepare proper meals for herself. During her first months alone, she lived in near starvation. At times, she boiled an egg over a small alcohol burner. Sometimes, she ate a little fruit or a piece of chocolate. But most of the time, her diet consisted of bread, butter, and tea. It was far from enough. Unsurprisingly, her health began to fail. She became weak, dizzy, and often fainted. When Kazimierz discovered how badly she was living, he and Bronia brought her back to their apartment, cared for her, gave her nourishing food and medicine, and helped her recover. But as soon as she regained her strength and returned to her attic room, she slipped back into the same habits. With examinations approaching, she became consumed once more by work and neglected her health all over again. Her fear of failure was not irrational. As soon as she entered the university, Marie realized that she had serious gaps in her preparation. French students had usually spent many years preparing for higher education, especially in science. Although she had educated herself with tremendous discipline, she could see that she had to work much harder than many of the others, just to catch up, especially in mathematics. The challenge was enormous, but it thrilled her as much as it frightened her. Later, she would remember those years as a time when a completely new world opened before her. She divided her days between lectures, laboratory work, and long hours of study in libraries. At night, she continued working alone in her room, often late into the night. Everything she learned excited her. Science, which had once been a distant dream, was now finally open to her. The Sorbonne itself carried a long and important history. It was one of the oldest universities in the world, with roots going back to the Middle Ages. Over time, it had changed dramatically. Once closely tied to church authority, it had become a more modern and secular institution, shaped by republican and anti-clerical ideas. This transformation suited Marie very well. She believed strongly in reason, evidence, and clear thought, and she had little patience for ideas that could not be supported. The sciences had become more central at the Sorbonne, and building projects were expanding classrooms and laboratories. Even so, French science education was still trying to recover from a period of weakness. After France's defeat in the Franco-Prussian War, many French thinkers had begun criticizing their own university system and admiring the research culture of German universities, which were seen as more modern and better equipped. By the time Marie arrived, reforms were already underway, and the science program had become stronger, though it still lagged behind the best institutions in Germany. What mattered most to Marie, however, was not the reputation of the university or even its buildings, but the teachers. She found many of them deeply inspiring. Among them was Gabriel Lippmann, a gifted physicist who later won the Nobel Prize. He brought a more experimental and practical view of physics into Paris and was known for designing highly sensitive scientific instruments. Another of her teachers was Joseph Boussinesq, who represented an older tradition of physics and taught the principles of classical mechanics in great detail. She was also taught by Henri Poincaré, one of the most brilliant mathematical minds of the age, whose work reached into both pure mathematics and the motions of celestial bodies. Through these and other professors, Marie encountered a wide range of scientific ideas, methods, and ways of thinking. This variety helped shape her own mind. In the classroom, she stood out not because she wanted attention, but because there were so few women at all. Most of the students were men, and among the few women, many were foreigners like herself. In fact, foreign women often outnumbered French women at the Sorbonne during that period. This reflected the broader realities of education in France. French girls generally did not receive the same level of secondary education as boys, and the system was not designed to prepare them for university entrance. Even when schools for girls existed, the curriculum was often weaker and less demanding. Laws passed in the late 19th century had improved matters somewhat, but real equality in education was still far away. For this reason, many women at the university came from abroad, where their own experiences had pushed them to seek opportunities elsewhere. As a foreign student, Marie also had more personal freedom than many French women. A French woman living alone and going out freely could still be judged harshly by society. Foreign women were often seen differently, and Marie, coming from a Polish background in which women were sometimes more outspoken and independent, accepted that freedom naturally. Even so, foreign women students were sometimes mocked. Some observers portrayed them as overly serious, plain, or unfeminine because they were devoted to their studies. But Marie cared little for such opinions. She had not come to Paris to win approval. She had come to learn. Gradually, she did begin to form a few connections. Some of her fellow students were friendly, though most of their conversations focused on studying. She also spent time with Polish students in Paris. None of them were in the physical sciences, but they offered companionship and a link to home. Among them were mathematicians, a biologist who would later marry her sister, Helena, and even a future president of Poland. Together, they took walks, talked politics in simple rooms, remembered their homeland, prepared Polish food at Christmas, and organized small cultural performances. Marie did not have enough free time to throw herself fully into these activities, but she did participate now and then, which displeased her father when he heard about it. In one of his letters, he warned her that even innocent public appearances could attract unwanted attention and damage her reputation, especially if she later returned to Poland and needed work. His caution reflected the fears that had long shaped the family's life under Russian rule. Whether or not her father's warnings changed her behavior, Marie soon pulled back from many of these social ties for a simpler reason. She needed all of her energy for study. After her first year, she realized that she could not afford distractions. Even her vacation time had to be spent on mathematics. As her first major physics examination approached, she became increasingly tense and withdrawn. She knew she had to master difficult material, and she had to do it in French, a language she spoke well but that still was not fully natural to her. The pressure was intense. She feared failure, feared disappointment, and feared discovering that she was not equal to the challenge she had fought so hard to reach. Yet those fears did not defeat her. When the examinations came in 1893, all the sacrifice, hunger, isolation, and relentless effort paid off. Marie passed her degree in physics, and not only passed it, but finished first in her class. It was an extraordinary achievement. Her father, hearing that she had taken the examinations, was filled with joy and hoped that this success might mean she would return home to live with him. But Marie now understood something essential. Mathematics was indispensable for the scientific path she wanted to follow. So instead of going back for good, she decided to remain in Paris and continue her studies. Her brilliance had not gone unnoticed. Because of her outstanding results, she received a scholarship that helped support her further work. When she returned to Paris, she explained in a letter that she was studying mathematics constantly so that she would be fully prepared when courses began again. She said that she was getting used to the effort, that it no longer exhausted her as before, and that she had no intention of giving it up. She kept that promise. At the end of the following year, she earned another degree, this time in mathematics, and placed second in her examinations. Looking back later, Marie remembered those years as difficult and at times painful, yet also deeply beautiful. Life in Paris was hard. She was poor, often tired, and still far from home. But for her, the hardships were outweighed by the freedom she had found. In that foreign city, speaking another language and living almost anonymously, she felt something that mattered more than comfort. After the painful end of her relationship with Kazimierz Zurawski, Marie no longer had any interest in romance. She told herself that she would never marry and decided instead to give all of her energy to study and work. At some point during this period, a man named Monsieur Lamotte seems to have admired her deeply. Very little is known about him, and what we know comes mainly from a farewell letter he sent to Marie while she was preparing for her final examinations in June 1894. In that letter, he promised not to disturb her by coming in person to say goodbye. He wished her happiness and success, but also gently reproached her for believing that he would quickly forget her once she was gone. He insisted that this would never happen. Even if they never met again, he told her that she had a friend somewhere who would always be ready to help her if she ever needed it. At that same time, Marie was finishing her mathematics degree and beginning to take on real scientific work. She was hired by the Society for the Encouragement of National Industry, a French organization created to support science and technology. Her assignment was to study the magnetic properties of different kinds of steel. It was a serious and useful project, but she faced an immediate problem. She did not have proper laboratory space. She needed equipment, room to work, and an environment where she could carry out careful measurements. While she was trying to solve this problem, a Polish physicist named Józef Kowalski and his wife, whom she had known since her governess years, happened to be in Paris on their honeymoon. When they heard about her difficulties, Kowalski suggested that she meet a friend of his, Marie Curie, who was already working on magnetism at a nearby institution and might be able to help. It is possible that the Kowalskis hoped this meeting would lead to something more personal, but even if they had such thoughts, no one involved could have imagined where it would eventually lead. When Marie met Marie Curie, he was 34 years old and already a professor at the School of Industrial Physics and Chemistry in Paris. He had built a reputation through his work in physics, especially through research he had carried out with his brother Jacques. Together, the two brothers had helped discover piezoelectricity, the ability of certain crystals to produce electricity when pressure is applied to them. It was an important scientific breakthrough, though neither Pierre nor Marie approached their first meeting with romance in mind. Pierre had once been deeply attached to a woman who died, and after that, he had more or less decided to live a quiet, solitary life, devoted to science. Marie, for her part, had her own clear plans. Once she completed her degrees, she intended to return to Poland, find work, and use her knowledge for teaching and for the improvement of her country. She had no thought of staying in Paris permanently, and she certainly did not imagine that she would marry there. Yet from the very first meeting, something was different between them. They came from different backgrounds, but they quickly discovered how much they had in common. They were both serious, shy, inward-looking people who cared little for social display. They both loved science deeply. They both distrusted conventional religion. And they both believed that life should be devoted to something greater than comfort or status. Pierre's own background helps explain why he and Marie understood each other so well. He came from a family filled with doctors, inventors, and unconventional thinkers. His father, Eugène Curie, was a doctor and a convinced Republican with skeptical views on religion and politics. Pierre and his brother were not raised in a traditional religious environment. Instead, they were brought up in a home where independent thought was valued and where respect for nature and truth mattered more than ritual. Pierre's father believed that his son was too dreamy and inward for a normal school education, so he chose to educate him at home. It was an unusual decision, but it allowed Pierre's mind to develop in its own way. He was not the kind of child who would necessarily flourish in a rigid classroom. He was quiet, reflective, and often lost in thought. In a normal school, he might easily have been mistaken for a slow student. But at home, with freedom to think and observe, he revealed a remarkable gift for science and mathematics. Pierre also developed a lifelong love of nature. Walks in the countryside around Paris helped him clear his mind and sharpen his ability to notice patterns in the world around him. he found peace away from the noise of the city. Even in his younger years, he wrote about how much he valued solitude and how good it felt to escape the small worries and distractions of Paris. This habit of reflection stayed with him throughout his life. His progress in science came early. He completed his secondary studies at 16 and had already decided that he wanted to become a laboratory physicist. After that, he studied physics at the Sorbonne and earned his degree when he was only 18. Strong recommendations from those who knew his abilities helped him secure a position assisting in laboratory teaching. He was soon put in charge of student laboratory work, and during those years he began doing serious experimental research. Although he had talent enough to pursue even more advanced academic goals, financial necessity held him back. He could not afford the additional years of formal study needed for a doctorate. For a long time, Pierre's closest intellectual relationship had been with his older brother Jacques. The two worked together closely in their early scientific careers. Their most famous work involved crystals. Scientists had long known that some crystals behaved strangely when heated. Certain surfaces developed electrical charges, and this phenomenon had fascinated researchers for years. Pierre and Jacques wondered whether heat itself was truly the cause, or whether the deeper reason was pressure inside the crystal structure. They designed experiments and built instruments to test their idea. Their work showed that when pressure was applied to certain crystals, electric charges appeared on opposite sides. This discovery became known as piezoelectricity, from a Greek word meaning to press. To study these tiny currents, they used an electrometer, a highly sensitive instrument capable of measuring very small electrical effects. Between 1880 and 1882, the brothers published several papers on this subject. Because Pierre had spent so much of his scientific life working in close partnership with Jacques, collaboration felt natural to him. He liked working near people he cared about. According to one of his students, Paul Langevin, Pierre needed emotional closeness in order to work comfortably. But when Jacques married and moved away to Montpellier, their collaboration could continue only during the summers. After that, Pierre accepted a post at the School of Industrial Physics and Chemistry. In terms of status, it was not especially impressive. The buildings were old, his laboratory was poorly equipped, and much of the work he wanted to do had to be delayed. He had only one assistant. Many ambitious men would have seen this as a frustrating setback. But Pierre did not seem overly troubled by it. He loved teaching, cared about his students, and had very little interest in climbing the academic ladder through politics, flattery, or networking. That was one of the defining features of his character. Pierre was almost completely indifferent to honours, social standing, and professional manoeuvring. He disliked the idea of competing for positions. If he was told that he should put himself forward for an appointment, he often refused, saying that he was not made for such things. On one occasion, when the director of his school planned to recommend him for a decoration, Pierre wrote back and asked him not to do so. He had already decided, he said, that he would never accept decorations of any kind. Freedom mattered more to him than recognition. He appreciated environments where he could work quietly and honestly, without being drawn into formal ambition. Marie later explained that his appointment at that school had been difficult for another reason. The laboratory conditions were poor. He had to build much of it almost from nothing. Because his experimental plans were interrupted, he turned for a time toward more abstract theoretical work, on crystals and symmetry. He published several papers in this area, exploring mathematical ideas about the structure and behavior of crystals. This work suited his imagination and his love of pure thought. Long before he met Marie, Pierre had written in his diary about the difficulty of reconciling great intellectual work with ordinary life. He believed that women of true genius were rare and feared that deep scientific commitment, often led to conflict in relationships. Then, he met Marie and found in her exactly what he had once thought almost impossible. A woman whose seriousness, intelligence, and devotion to science matched his own. She impressed him deeply. He admired her scientific ability, her success in study, and her strength of character. The two complemented each other in striking ways. Marie was disciplined, determined, and intensely focused. Pierre was imaginative, idealistic, and somewhat dreamy. Both had strong ideals, but they expressed them differently. Marie still felt that she owed something to Poland and imagined returning there to help her people. Pierre believed more and more that science itself was the best path toward improving human life. This difference became one of the central questions in their relationship. Pierre was convinced that scientific progress could do more for justice and human well-being than politics often could. Social and political movements, in his view, could fail or even make things worse. Science, by contrast, offered a more dependable path. In his letters to Marie, he tried hard to persuade her that the two of them together could use science for the good of humanity. For Pierre, collaboration in both life and science made perfect sense. Marie was slower to accept this idea. She had always worked alone. She had also been badly hurt in love before, and she was not eager to trust again. But Pierre's gentleness, sincerity, and deep kinship with her values gradually wore down her hesitation. It was not an easy process. Pierre became frustrated at times, especially when Marie spoke as though she were entirely free to choose any path without being influenced by emotional ties. He argued that none of us are ever completely free because we are all shaped by the people we love and by the expectations surrounding us. Still, he never gave up. During the summer when Marie was back in Poland, he wrote to her repeatedly, asking her to return. He imagined a life in which the two of them could remain close while each pursued shared ideals, her dream for Poland and their broader dreams for humanity and science. He even pointed out practical realities. In Paris, he said, there would be opportunities for her that would be harder to find elsewhere. If she married a Frenchman, she would become French in the eyes of the state, which could make her future easier. Marie did come back to Paris, but she did not at first accept all of Pierre's hopes. When he proposed that they rent an apartment together, she refused and chose instead to live beside Bronia's medical office. Even after returning, she still spoke of eventually living in Poland. Pierre, increasingly desperate not to lose her, went so far as to promise that he would come to Poland with her if necessary. He said he would do whatever he had to do to make a living there, even teach French if that was what it took. He also enlisted Bronia's help, having already won her over to his side. Step by step, the possibility of marriage became more real, though each of them had principles and habits that would need adjusting. Money was another issue. Pierre did not have much of it, and if he wanted both to continue his work and to marry, he needed some additional income. Reluctantly, he accepted a position as technical advisor to a Parisian optical firm. The work paid him a modest monthly fee, and he also received royalties from a photographic lens he had designed. Even so, the income was not enough to promise a comfortable life. If Marie had been interested in wealth or social position, Pierre would have been a poor choice. He lacked worldly ambition and had no talent for using achievement to gain comfort. But Marie cared little for those things. What mattered to her was character, shared purpose, and intellectual companionship. In Pierre, she found a man who was kind, honest, and devoted to science in the same uncompromising way that she was. As their relationship deepened, Pierre introduced Marie to his parents. They lived in a modest old house in Sceaux, outside Paris, surrounded by a rich garden. Marie liked Pierre's father very much. Marie Curie impressed her with his intelligence, his passion for science, and the sense that he had once sacrificed some of his own intellectual hopes for the sake of family duty. though he had wanted a life more centered on science. He had practiced medicine in order to support his household. He had passed on to his sons a love of scientific inquiry and had encouraged them in a way that many parents of the time would not have done. Marie saw in him a strong, authoritative man, but also a generous and deeply helpful one. Pierre's mother, though physically delicate and often in uncertain health, had made the home gentle and welcoming. Not long after meeting his family, Marie also attended Pierre's public doctoral examination at the Sorbonne, where he defended his thesis on magnetism. She was deeply impressed by the quality of his answers and by the seriousness of his work. It confirmed what she already felt, that they were moving through the same intellectual world, guided by similar values. Even so, their temperaments were not identical. Marie, though uninterested in luxury, was more willing than Pierre to recognize the practical value of success and official recognition. Pierre almost recoiled from prizes and honors. His modesty, combined with his dislike of self-promotion, kept him from obtaining some of the positions he deserved. Yet after he presented his thesis in March 1895, a professorship was finally created for him at the School of Industrial Physics and Chemistry. By then, the relationship had reached its natural conclusion. Marie later described it very simply. After returning from vacation, their friendship became more and more precious, and each came to understand that no better life companion could be found. They decided to marry, and the wedding took place in July 1895. In keeping with both of their beliefs, the ceremony was as simple as possible. It was a civil ceremony, not a religious one. Pierre had no religious faith, and Marie did not practice religion either. Their marriage was based not on tradition or display, but on mutual respect and shared conviction. Even Marie's wedding dress reflected her practical character. If not for the generosity of her brother-in-law's mother, she might have been married in the one plain dress she already owned. When offered a dress, she specifically requested something dark and practical, something she could continue wearing afterward to the laboratory. Brongniart, who cared more about appearance than Marie did, took charge and guided her to a dressmaker. The result was a tasteful navy blue wool suit with a blue blouse striped in lighter blue. It was modest, sensible, and completely suited to the bride. Some of the wedding guests were much more formally dressed, but Marie paid little attention to such things. After the civil ceremony at the town hall in Sceaux, attended by family members from both sides, the newly married couple did something unusual for their honeymoon. Rather than take a grand trip in comfort, they gave each other bicycles, purchased with money from a wedding gift, and set off to explore Brittany. This was not as strange as it might sound to modern ears, because by the 1890s, bicycles had become a major new craze. The newer safety bicycle, with two wheels of equal size, had replaced the older high front wheel version that had once been common. It was more stable, more comfortable, and far less dangerous. Cycling had become popular among many different kinds of people, including women. It was used for exercise, travel, and pleasure. Marie, who had no interest in fashion for its own sake, was delighted that cycling gave her an excuse to set aside long skirts in favour of practical clothing. She wore knickers, knee stockings, and simple rubber-soled shoes. For her, comfort and freedom mattered more than elegance. The bicycles turned out to be one of the best gifts the couple could have chosen. On weekends and holidays, Pierre and Marie would often leave Paris behind and ride together through the countryside. These trips became one of the few forms of recreation they truly enjoyed. Their early married years were simple and intensely focused. Aside from these cycling outings and occasional visits with family, their lives were built almost entirely around work, study, and scientific conversation. Their first home was a small 3-room apartment not far from Pierre's school. Marie later said that its main charm was the view over a large garden. Since they could not afford servants, she took on most of the household tasks herself. Even so, she tried to reduce domestic life to the bare minimum. She knew that a conventional household, full of furniture, social obligations, and elaborate meals, could swallow up her time and energy. So, she made deliberate choices. She taught herself to prepare simple meals that required little effort. The apartment contained only what was necessary. When Pierre's father offered them extra furniture, they refused, because more furniture meant more cleaning, more dusting, and more wasted time. Their home was arranged not for show, but for efficiency. It was a life designed to protect Marie's ability to work. During the first year of marriage, Marie prepared for the examination that would qualify her to teach in a girls' secondary school. After months of study, she passed in 1896 and ranked first. At the same time, she also attended courses for her own development, including one taught by the theoretical physicist Marcel Brillouin. Pierre, meanwhile, continued his research on crystals, trying to understand why different faces of crystals developed in different ways. He obtained interesting results, though he did not publish them, and eventually his later work would draw him away from that line of inquiry. He also worked hard on his teaching. At first, his courses covered both crystallography and electricity, but he soon realized that electricity had wider practical importance and deserved more attention. Marie proudly believed that his lectures became some of the clearest and most modern in Paris. He planned to turn them into a book, but future research would prevent that project from being completed. Marie was allowed to work in the same school, though she had to fund her own research. The chance was invaluable. Pierre's experience and knowledge broadened her own understanding, and she began work on a study of how the magnetic properties of different steels changed, depending on their chemical composition. This project led to her first scientific paper, completed in the autumn of 1897. The topic itself was not especially original, but it gave her vital laboratory experience and exposed her to methods she would soon use in much more important work. She had access to steel samples and advice not only from Pierre, but also from the well-known chemist Henri Le Chatelier. Marie herself understood that the paper was not groundbreaking, but she also knew that it was far better than giving lessons, and that it allowed her to establish herself in real scientific work. At that time, women in science still faced enormous limits. Even those who were talented often ended up in repetitive, low-status work, rather than in the most creative parts of research. Many women entered fields such as botany or astronomy because those areas allowed room for amateurs, or provided jobs men did not want. In astronomy, for example, women were often employed as computers, sorting and classifying data produced by new photographic technologies. They were underpaid and rarely recognized, but the work gave them an entry point. Some women found another route through areas considered appropriate for women, such as home economics, which allowed scientific training without direct competition from men. Others advanced through collaboration with male relatives, mentors, or husbands. In many such partnerships, the woman's contribution was overlooked or automatically credited to the man. Marie faced these same obstacles, but her response was distinctive. She did not merely try to fit into a narrow space allowed to women. Instead, she reshaped her whole life so that science could remain at its center. She cut away whatever she saw as non-essential. She tolerated discomfort, simplified the home, reduced social life, and trained herself to do just enough domestic work to keep life functioning. In effect, she and Pierre designed a marriage that would make serious scientific work possible for both of them, especially for her. It was an unusual and highly deliberate arrangement. Marie later wrote that during those years their shared life revolved around laboratory experiments, lectures, and examinations. For 11 years, she said, they were hardly ever separated, which is why so little correspondence exists between them from that period. They did take breaks, mostly in the form of walking or cycling trips, either in the countryside near Paris, by the sea, or in the mountains. But even on those excursions, Pierre's thoughts often returned to science. He could admire beautiful landscapes and still remain mentally absorbed by the questions that fascinated him. Then, another major change came. In 1897, Marie learned that she was pregnant with their first child. In the world of that time, the idea that a woman could be both a serious scientist and a mother seemed almost impossible. Pregnancy was widely assumed to mark the end of any scientific career a woman might have begun. To make matters worse, the early months were physically miserable for Marie. She suffered constant dizziness, growing weakness and low spirits. She did not necessarily look ill, but she felt unable to work as she wanted, and this frustrated her deeply. She complained that she could not stand at her apparatus and continue her magnetic studies as she wished. At the same time, sorrow entered the family from another direction. Pierre's beloved mother became seriously ill with breast cancer. He spent much of that period going back and forth to be with her, leaving Marie more alone during a difficult pregnancy. She worried not only about herself, but about what the timing might do to Pierre emotionally, if his mother died just as their child was born. In the end, those fears were justified. Even so, the couple behaved in their own unconventional way. When Marie was already 8 months pregnant, Pierre took her on a cycling trip to Brest. To most people, such a journey would have seemed extraordinary, perhaps even reckless, so late in pregnancy. Yet they did not appear to think of it as especially unusual. Eventually, they shortened the trip and returned to Paris. On September 12th, 1897, Marie gave birth to their daughter Irène. The baby weighed 6.5 pounds, and the couple had spent the summer preparing for her arrival. Just 2 weeks later, Pierre's mother died. The birth of Irène created a new practical challenge. Childcare has always been one of the greatest obstacles for women trying to continue scientific work, and for a family that was never financially secure, Marie's career might easily have stalled at that moment. But once again, family support changed the situation. Pierre's father, Eugène, now a widower, moved in with the young couple and quickly became deeply attached to his granddaughter. Marie at first tried to nurse the baby herself, but when that failed, she had to hire a wet nurse. There followed a series of nurses and domestic helpers. But the most reliable and loving source of support turned out to be Eugène himself. His presence made it possible for Marie to continue her work instead of giving it up. Around them, Paris itself was transforming. Marie and Pierre remained somewhat distant from the more flamboyant and showy side of the city. But they lived in the middle of a remarkable age. Paris at the end of the 19th century was one of the great creative capitals of the world. In painting, Impressionism and its aftermath had reshaped artistic vision through figures like Degas, Monet, Renoir, and Van Gogh. In music and poetry too, new forms were appearing. Claude Debussy and Stéphane Mallarmé helped create an atmosphere of experiment and sensitivity that stretched far beyond the sciences. Henri Toulouse-Lautrec captured another side of Paris, the nightlife of cabarets and bohemian neighborhoods like Montmartre, where entertainment, excess, and spectacle mixed freely. New technology added to the excitement of the city. Even if Marie and Pierre did not embrace every modern trend, they could hardly ignore them. The Eiffel Tower had risen above Paris in 1889, the tallest structure in the world at the time. Gas lights were giving way to electric lighting. Telephones, moving pictures, and electric streetcars were changing daily life. Paris was becoming a modern city in ways that were both thrilling and unsettling. Beneath that surface brilliance, however, there were darker tensions. The same Paris that celebrated progress and style also carried deep fears and resentments. France had never fully recovered emotionally from its defeat in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 1871. The humiliation of that loss had damaged national pride. Napoleon III had fallen, Paris had endured turmoil, and the bloody suppression of the Paris Commune had left scars that did not easily disappear. The Third Republic emerged from that violence, but political instability remained. In 1894, another crisis exposed even uglier currents in French society. A Jewish army officer, Alfred Dreyfus, was accused of spying for Germany. The evidence against him was weak and dishonest, but because he was Jewish and because the country was already full of suspicion, he was quickly treated as guilty. He was convicted and sent away to prison for life on Devil's Island. Even after the true culprit was identified, large sections of the public and press continued to hate and denounce Dreyfus. The case revealed how deeply anti-Semitism had spread through French society. At the same time, anarchism also gained visibility. In theory, anarchism called for a society free from oppressive authority, built on voluntary cooperation rather than government control. Some intellectuals found this vision attractive, but in practice, parts of the movement turned violent, and during the early 1890s, several bombs exploded in Paris. Fear of disorder mixed with fear of foreigners, distrust of institutions, and political bitterness. Science, too, was not untouched by the tensions of the time. Some critics saw science as too closely linked with the secular, anti-clerical spirit of the Third Republic. Others accused scientists of making grand promises about progress that reality could not always fulfill. Yet it was also a period of astonishing breakthroughs. New discoveries were transforming the understanding of matter, energy, and the natural world. In this charged atmosphere, Marie and Pierre Curie held firmly to their belief that science and reason offered one of the surest paths toward human advancement. Marie Curie believed deeply in the power of science, and she knew that if she truly wanted to be taken seriously, she needed a doctoral degree. At that time, this was an almost impossible goal. No woman in Europe had yet completed such a degree in science. The idea that a married woman, especially one with a child, could achieve this was widely dismissed. Many of her colleagues openly doubted her. They believed that a woman in her position simply could not succeed. But Marie was not someone who accepted limits easily. Even while preparing her earlier work on steel for publication, she had already begun searching for a subject worthy of a doctoral thesis. She followed scientific developments closely, and one discovery in particular caught her attention. Wilhelm Röntgen's mysterious X-rays, announced in 1895. Röntgen had been studying electrical discharge in vacuum tubes. Inside these tubes, invisible particles, what we now call electrons, travelled from a negatively charged electrode, the cathode, toward a positively charged one, the anode. When these particles struck the glass walls of the tube, they produced a faint glow. This glow fascinated scientists, but what Röntgen discovered went far beyond that. He wrapped the tube in black cardboard to block out all visible light and worked in a darkened room. When he activated the device, something unexpected happened. A screen coated with a special chemical began to glow, even though it was not directly exposed to the tube. Somehow, invisible rays were escaping and travelling through the cardboard. To test this further, Röntgen moved the screen into another room, closed the door, and continued the experiment. The glowing still occurred. These rays could pass through materials that ordinary light could not. They could even pass through thin metal. Unlike known rays, they were not affected by electric or magnetic fields. Röntgen did not know what they were, so he simply called them X-rays, unknown rays. In one of his most famous experiments, he placed his wife's hand in front of a photographic plate and exposed it to these rays. When the image developed, the bones of her hand appeared clearly, along with the outline of her ring. It was the first time humans had ever seen inside the body, without cutting it open. The discovery shocked the world. Scientists and the public alike were fascinated. X-rays seemed almost magical. They could pass through flesh but not bone, opening the door to medical imaging. Demonstrations were held across Europe. People were amazed to see skeletons revealed beneath living skin. Some uses were even playful. In shoe shops, children would place their feet inside devices that let them see their own bones, just to check if the shoes fit properly. No one yet understood the dangers. This sudden wave of excitement sparked a race among scientists. Many began searching for other unknown types of radiation. Some claimed discoveries that later proved false, such as black light or N-rays. These episodes showed how easily scientists could sometimes see what they wanted to see, especially when chasing something exciting. But not all discoveries were illusions. In France, another scientist, Henri Becquerel, became interested in whether certain glowing materials, those that continue to shine after being exposed to light, might produce rays similar to X-rays. He experimented with uranium salts, placing them on photographic plates wrapped in black paper. He expected that sunlight would activate the material and produce an image. At first, this seemed to work, but then something strange happened. During a period of bad weather, when there was no sunlight at all, Becquerel repeated the experiment anyway. When he developed the photographic plate, he was shocked. The image had appeared just as strongly as before. This meant that sunlight was not the cause. The radiation was coming directly from the uranium itself. Without fully realizing it, Becquerel had discovered a completely new phenomenon. He believed it was related to phosphorescence, but in reality, he had uncovered something far more fundamental: radioactivity. Still, he did not fully understand what he had found. Marie Curie saw something in this discovery that others had overlooked. While many scientists lost interest, she became deeply intrigued. She decided that this mysterious radiation would be the subject of her doctoral research. To study it, she needed a laboratory. What she received instead was a cramped, poorly equipped room, more like a storage space than a proper lab. It was damp, cold in winter, and stifling in summer. But for Marie, it was enough. Using sensitive instruments developed by Pierre, she began measuring how different substances affected the air's ability to conduct electricity. She tested one material after another. Then she made a crucial discovery. Not only uranium, but also another element, thorium, produced similar radiation. This was important, but her next insight was even more revolutionary. She realized that the radiation did not depend on the chemical form of the material. It did not matter if the substance was solid or powdered, wet or dry. The intensity of the radiation depended only on how much of the element was present. This meant one thing: the radiation was coming from the atom itself. This idea was extraordinary. At that time, atoms were believed to be stable and unchanging. Marie's work suggested that atoms could emit energy on their own. It was a completely new way of understanding matter. But she did not stop there. When she tested uranium ore, especially a mineral called pitchblende, she found something even more surprising. The ore was far more radioactive than pure uranium. This could only mean one thing: the ore contained other, unknown substances that were even more active. Marie was convinced she had found something new. Together with Pierre, she began the long and exhausting process of isolating these unknown elements. They crushed the ore, dissolved it in acid, separated it into components, and measured each one's activity. Again and again, they repeated the process, keeping the most active portions and discarding the rest. It was slow, difficult, and physically demanding work. After months of effort, they identified a substance far more active than uranium. In July 1898, they announced the discovery of a new element. Marie named it polonium. in honor of her homeland, Poland. But the story did not end there. They soon discovered that even after removing polonium, the remaining material was still highly radioactive. This led them to a second new element, one far more powerful. They called it radium. Radium was astonishing. It was hundreds of times more radioactive than uranium. It emitted a faint blue glow, almost like something alive. It captivated the scientific world. Yet discovering these elements was only the beginning. To convince others, Marie needed to isolate them in pure form. This required enormous amounts of raw material, tons of pitchblende. The Curies could not afford it easily, but they managed to obtain the waste residue from mining operations. It was cheap because the useful uranium had already been removed. In a crude, abandoned shed, once used for medical dissection, they began their work. The conditions were terrible. In summer, the shed was unbearably hot. In winter, it was freezing. Rain leaked through the roof. The floor was dirt. There was almost no proper equipment, and yet, this is where history was made. Marie worked tirelessly. She stirred boiling chemicals in large vats, lifted heavy containers, and processed material day after day. It was exhausting. Physical labour, far removed from the image of a quiet laboratory scientist. And still, she later said these were the happiest years of her life. By 1902, after processing more than a ton of material, she finally succeeded. She produced a tiny amount, just a fraction of a gram, of nearly pure radium. She calculated its atomic weight and confirmed its identity. In 1903, she presented her doctoral thesis on radioactive substances. The room was filled with people, scientists, friends, curious observers. Her work had already begun to attract attention. After her defense, she was awarded her doctorate with the highest honors. She had done what no woman in Europe had done before, and in doing so, she had opened the door to an entirely new field of science. The year 1903 became one of the most emotional and dramatic periods in the lives of Marie and Pierre Curie. It brought some of their greatest triumphs, but also some of their deepest pain. Earlier that year, Marie had lost her beloved father, a man whose influence had shaped her love of learning and science from childhood. Yet this same year also brought one of the greatest achievements of her life. She successfully defended her doctoral thesis and became the first woman in France to earn a doctorate. The committee examining her work, which included leading scientists and future Nobel Prize winners, judged her thesis with the highest praise. It was a moment of extraordinary recognition. But even in a year of such success, the Curie's life never seemed to move in a straight line. Joy and sorrow, recognition and suffering, all came together. During this same period, Pierre travelled to London, with Marie by his side, to deliver an invited lecture at the Royal Institution. By then, Pierre's health had become increasingly fragile. Just before he was due to speak, he was so weak that even getting dressed became difficult. Yet once he stepped forward and began his lecture, he seemed to gather strength. The talk was a success, and the audience was fascinated by the strange properties of radium. Pierre even performed small demonstrations with the substance itself, not realizing that the very material he was handling so freely was likely contributing to his declining health. At one point, he accidentally spilled a tiny amount of radium in the building. Decades later, the lingering contamination would still be strong enough to require cleanup. As Pierre spoke, Marie sat in the audience. Much of the work he described had also been hers, but the setting naturally encouraged people to see Pierre as the central figure. Even so, Pierre himself always made a point of recognizing Marie's essential role and treating her as a true scientific partner. Their visit to England also brought them into contact with some of the most respected names in British science. They met leading figures such as William Crookes, Lord Rayleigh, Oliver Lodge, and Lord Kelvin. Kelvin, though not fully convinced that radium was truly a new element, treated the Curies with great warmth and curiosity. He welcomed them into his laboratory and took a serious interest in what they were doing. Another meaningful experience came through their hosts, the astronomers William and Margaret Huggins. For Marie, this couple left a strong impression because they were another example of a husband and wife working side by side in science. Their collaboration was not identical to that of the Curies, because Margaret had not received formal scientific training, yet she had developed considerable skill and made real contributions to her husband's work. Marie was pleased to see another marriage built around shared scientific purpose, and she deeply respected the partnership she observed in their home. But 1903 also brought Marie personal heartbreak. That year, she lost a child after giving birth prematurely, following one of the bicycle trips she and Pierre loved so much. At the time, she'd been exposed to very high levels of radiation, though she did not connect that exposure with the loss of the baby. In a letter to her sister Bronia, she wrote sadly that the little girl had been born alive, and that she had desperately wanted the child. Friends had already warned both Marie and Pierre that they were living too harshly. One of their colleagues had scolded them for not eating properly and for discussing physics even at mealtimes. Looking back, Marie blamed her own way of living for the miscarriage. She believed that exhaustion, poor diet, and relentless overwork had caused the loss. This belief burdened her with a deep and painful sense of guilt. Soon after, another tragedy shook her even further. Bronia lost her 5-year-old son to meningitis. The child had seemed healthy and strong, which made the shock even worse. Marie wrote about how terrifying this was. If even a healthy child could be lost so suddenly, how could any mother ever feel safe? After that, she found herself looking at her own daughter Irene with fear instead of calm. She loved her child deeply, but now every moment carried anxiety. The death of her nephew and the loss of her own baby left Marie physically and emotionally weakened. She remained ill through the rest of the summer and into the autumn. While recovering, she and Pierre spent a long period on the island of Oléron. By the end of September, she felt better, though doctors said she was still anemic. Today, it is hard not to notice the likely connection between this condition and her radiation exposure. But at the time, neither she nor the doctors understood what was happening. Even amid all this suffering, important recognition continued to arrive. French scientific institutions that had once hesitated to take the Curies fully seriously now began to reward their work. The Academy of Sciences had already given them a major prize for isolating radium. In 1903, Marie received the Gegner Prize once again, this time for the 3rd time, in recognition of her scientific promise. Pierre also received a major award of his own. Later that same year, while Marie was still recovering, the Royal Society in London honoured them with the Davy Medal. Step by step, their work was winning acceptance at the highest levels. That year also marked an important moment in how Marie was presented to the wider public. In June 1903, an American magazine called The Independent published an article by her explaining her research on radioactive substances in language general readers could understand. The editor carefully introduced her as a serious scientist and pointed out that she was about to defend what would become the highest scientific degree granted in France. The article was placed alongside pieces on politics, society, religion, and international affairs, showing that the editor believed radioactivity was not just a narrow scientific topic, but something of broad importance. What struck the editor most was that many people had heard rumours that a woman had played a major role in the discovery of radium, and he wanted to make it clear that Marie was not a minor figure at all. In fact, he went so far as to suggest that in this great scientific achievement, Pierre could almost be seen as the helper of his wife, rather than the other way around. For Marie, This publication was important because it showed she could present difficult scientific ideas with clarity and confidence to a wider public. Then, late in 1903, came the announcement that would change their lives forever. The Nobel Prize in Physics was awarded jointly to Henri Becquerel and the Curies. Newspapers in the United States and elsewhere quickly reported the news. Many pointed out that the Curies had never made personal profit from their discoveries, and so the prize money would be especially welcome. But behind the scenes, Marie had very nearly been excluded. At first, only Pierre and Becquerel had been nominated. Marie's role was ignored, even though the work on radioactivity had been deeply shaped by her ideas, her measurements, and her persistence. One of the Nobel Committee members, the Swedish mathematician Gösta Mittag-Leffler, who strongly supported women in science, informed Pierre of the situation. Pierre immediately wrote back and insisted that if he were to be honoured for their research, Marie must be included as well. Fortunately, because Marie had received nominations in a previous year, her name could still legally be considered. In this way, she was added, and the prize became a shared one. Even then, the wording of the award reflected the complicated politics of science. The prize was officially given for their joint research on the radiation first discovered by Becquerel, rather than directly for the discovery of radium itself. That decision left open the possibility that the discovery of radium might later be honoured separately in chemistry. Still, the importance of the 1903 prize was enormous. Marie Curie became one of the very few women in history to receive a Nobel Prize in science. At that time, such a thing was almost unthinkable. Even long afterward, women Nobel winners in scientific fields remained extremely rare. In 1903, Marie's presence among the laureates was highly unusual, and many people found it easier to accept because she worked alongside her husband. The ceremony itself reflected those attitudes. In the speech honouring the Curies, the speaker praised the strength of husband and wife cooperation, and even quoted the Bible about woman being made as a helpmate to man. The wording was polite and celebratory, but it still carried the old assumption that the male scientist stood at the centre while the woman supported him. The Nobel Prize brought the Curies enormous prestige, but it also shattered the quiet, private life they had once enjoyed. Suddenly, they were famous. Journalists, photographers, and curious visitors from all over the world descended on them. Newspapers wrote not only about their work, but about their home, their child, and even their cat. People wrote asking for money, for advice, for visits, and for help. Pierre hated all of it. In a letter to a friend, he complained bitterly about the foolish excitement surrounding radium and about the endless interruptions that left no peace in the laboratory. Marie felt the same. She wrote to family that their once orderly and hard-working life had been completely disrupted, and that she did not know if it would ever return to normal. Neither Marie nor Pierre went to Stockholm in 1903 to receive the Nobel Prize in person. Both were in poor health, and they also used their teaching obligations as a reason to stay away. It was not until 1905 that they finally travelled to Sweden, where Pierre gave the required Nobel lecture. He was shy, nervous, and uncomfortable in formal surroundings. But once he began speaking seriously about their work, the audience listened with admiration. By then, Marie's place in the scientific story was much harder to deny. This mattered greatly to both of them. Many people in the scientific world still assumed that Marie was simply Pierre's assistant. But Pierre never accepted that view. He was used to scientific collaboration from his years working with his brother Jacques, and he believed naturally in shared discovery. Marie also had the confidence to insist, quietly but firmly, on her own place. When she alone made a discovery, she published under her own name. When work was truly shared, the two published together, and they were careful to make clear who had contributed what. As early as 1898, Marie had published under her own name on the radioactivity of thorium and on the idea that pitch blende must contain a new, highly active element. In their joint papers, they continued to acknowledge each other's contributions. This helped strengthen both their identity as a collaborative couple and Marie's reputation as an independent scientist. At the same time, they did not openly challenge the cultural assumptions of their age. In joint work, Pierre's name still came first. They sought fairness, but they did so within the boundaries of a male-dominated scientific world. By the early 20th century, Marie's idea that radioactivity was an atomic property had begun to help transform science itself. For centuries, the atom had been imagined as the smallest possible unit of matter, something indivisible. The Greek word atomos literally meant uncuttable, but the strange behavior of radioactive substances began to undermine that ancient idea. Scientists were forced to ask whether the atom could actually be divided into smaller parts. Lord Kelvin and other older physicists resisted this possibility for as long as they could, but evidence kept building. J. Thomson showed that cathode rays were streams of tiny negatively charged particles, much smaller than atoms. These came to be called electrons. That meant the atom was not indivisible after all. Then Ernest Rutherford and his collaborators pushed the story further. By firing alpha particles at thin gold foil, they discovered that while most passed straight through, a small number were sharply deflected, and a tiny fraction even bounced back. This result made no sense under older models of the atom. Rutherford concluded that most of the atom's mass must be packed into a tiny central nucleus, with electrons occupying the space around it. Later, other researchers showed that radioactive substances also gave off gamma rays. Slowly, a new picture of the atom emerged. Not a solid, indivisible particle, but a structure containing smaller pieces. In this changing scientific world, the work of the Curies remained central. One of their most puzzling observations was that radium produced measurable heat all by itself. This seemed to violate one of the most basic laws of physics, the idea that energy cannot simply appear from nowhere. Marie suggested two possibilities. Either radioactive substances were somehow drawing in energy from outside and releasing it, or the energy was coming from within the substance itself. Rutherford carried the matter further. He found that certain radioactive materials gave off gases, and that these gases themselves were radioactive. If they touched other objects, those objects could temporarily become radioactive too. The solution to the mystery developed through collaboration, especially between Rutherford and the chemist Frederick Soddy. Together, they showed that radioactive elements were breaking down into other elements by emitting particles. These changes happened at fixed rates, which Rutherford described through the idea of half-life. Their work revealed something astonishing. One element could actually turn into another. For centuries, alchemists had dreamed of transforming base metals into gold. Now, in a completely different and scientifically real way, modern physics had shown that transmutation was possible after all. Radioactive substances were doing it naturally, without the need for magical formulas or ancient rituals. After the Nobel Prize, the years 1904 and 1905 brought further changes. The prize money eased some of the family's financial pressure, but it did not remove the physical toll of their work. Both Marie and Pierre were growing increasingly ill, though they still did not understand that radiation was slowly damaging them. Pierre remained frustrated by how long it had taken him to receive proper recognition in France. For years he had been denied the kind of professorship he deserved. At last, the French Parliament created a new chair specifically for him, along with a laboratory and some support staff. For Marie, this change was especially important. For the first time, she had official status in Pierre's laboratory. She was appointed head of the research laboratory and received a salary of her own. It was a significant professional step forward. At the same time, Marie was pregnant again. The earlier miscarriage had left a lasting sadness, but in late 1905, she gave birth to another daughter, Eve Denise. The pregnancy had been difficult, and Marie remained tired and physically strained afterward, but the birth itself was a joy. Eve was a healthy baby, though lively and far from easy to care for. Marie wrote to family about how different Eve seemed from Irene, with darker hair and blue eyes compared to her sister's lighter colouring. Even after giving birth, Marie eventually returned to teaching at Sèvres, though by now the Nobel money meant she no longer needed the salary. She continued partly because she enjoyed teaching young women and partly because she valued the intellectual company there, including that of the physicist Paul Langevin. Teaching had once been difficult for her. At first, her accent and stiff style had made her a target of student mockery. But over time, she changed her methods. Rather than relying only on formal lectures, she began using demonstrations and practical experiments. The students responded enthusiastically, and she became one of the most popular teachers at the school. At the same time, the Curie's social life opened slightly. They attended gatherings hosted by friends such as the Borels, met with scientists and artists, and welcomed visitors to their home. Marie even allowed herself to buy better clothes for the family, something she had long resisted. Pierre, however, still struggled with the demands of status and institutions. Once again, he was pushed by friends to seek election to the French Academy of Sciences. This time, he won, though only narrowly, and the whole process left him feeling awkward rather than proud. He disliked the need to campaign, visit Academy members, and behave as a candidate asking for approval. He felt out of place in such rituals. The same dislike appeared when honours were proposed for him. When one official suggested he be given the Legion of Honour, Pierre replied that what he truly needed was not a medal, but a laboratory. Despite their growing fame, the Curies refused to patent their method of producing radium. They believed science should be shared freely and not turned into private profit. Whenever other researchers or companies asked how the process worked, they explained it openly. As a result, other people began making money from radium while the Curies, the discoverers themselves, still struggled to fund their work. In the end, they had to seek help from wealthy supporters to continue their research. It was a perfect example of how idealistic and impractical they could both be. By 1906, Pierre's condition had worsened seriously. Yet even then, neither he nor Marie fully grasped the danger they were living with every day. One of Pierre's last published studies, written with medical colleagues, examined the effects of radioactive substances on laboratory animals. They found severe damage in the lungs and blood cells of the animals exposed to radioactive gas. The results clearly showed that radium could cause serious harm, and yet, even with this evidence in front of them, the Curies still did not fully apply those lessons to themselves. In April 1906, Pierre joined Marie and their daughters for a short break in the countryside. Spring in France can often be cold and unpleasant, but for a few days the weather was calm and beautiful. Even though Marie was worried about how tired Pierre had become, the family still managed to enjoy a peaceful time away from Paris. For a moment, they were free from the demands of work, the strain of public attention, and the pressure that had come with their growing fame. Pierre returned to Paris on April 14th, while Marie stayed behind a little longer with the children. 2 days later, after the weather turned wet and cold, she brought the girls back to the city. That same evening, Marie and Pierre attended a dinner of the Physics Society. At that dinner, one of the topics people discussed was spiritualism. During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, many respected scientists became fascinated by seances, mediums, and the possibility of contact with the dead. Pierre himself had attended seances led by the well-known medium Eusapia Palladino. He was especially intrigued because he could not easily explain away some of what he had seen. He was not alone in this interest. A number of prominent scientists of the time were willing to explore such strange questions. Pierre's curiosity was part of a broader scientific culture that sometimes crossed into the mysterious and the unexplained. On April 17th, Pierre attended another meeting of the Physics Society. This time he spoke about something else that deeply interested him: the teaching of science. He cared greatly about education and wanted science to be taught in a better and more thoughtful way. His ideas were warmly received, and he was elected vice president of a new group connected with these efforts. The success of that meeting lifted his spirits. For someone who had often felt frustrated by institutions and professional politics, it was a rare moment when he felt truly appreciated. The next day, Thursday, April 19th, Pierre left his laboratory and walked through the cold rain toward another meeting. When it ended shortly after 2 in the afternoon, he stepped back into the busy streets of Paris, carrying with him a sense of energy and satisfaction. His mind was clearly occupied by the people he had seen and the ideas they had shared. It was raining harder now, and traffic had become heavier. He walked behind a cab for a little shelter, holding up his umbrella. Then, as he approached a crowded intersection, he moved away from the cab and absent-mindedly stepped into the path of a horse pulling a wagon. At that exact moment, the wagon was passing close beside the cab, and the space between them narrowed suddenly. Pierre, whose thoughts were far from the traffic around him, seems to have been caught off guard. Realizing too late how little room he had, he reached toward the horse in an attempt to steady himself or avoid being crushed. But the horse reared. Pierre slipped on the wet pavement, and the crowd shouted for the driver to stop. The driver pulled on the reins, but the horses kept moving forward. Pierre fell under the wagon. The front wheels passed over him without touching him. For an instant, it seemed he might survive. But then the left rear wheel rolled over his head and killed him instantly. A crowd gathered almost at once. Some people tried to stop passing drivers and persuade them to carry the body to the police station, but the cabmen refused because they did not want blood to stain their seats. Eventually, 2 men brought a stretcher and carried Pierre to a nearby police station. There, officials examined his papers and realized who he was. Though his skull had been crushed, his face could still be recognized, and one of his assistants later identified the body. When the people around the station learned that the dead man was Marie Curie, the Nobel Prize-winning scientist, anger quickly turned toward the wagon driver. The police had to protect him from the crowd. It was decided that 2 close friends, Paul Appel and Jean Perrin, would go to tell Marie. But when they arrived at the Curie home, she was not yet back. Only Pierre's father, Eugène Curie, was there. The moment he saw their faces, he understood. His first words were simple and terrible. "My son is dead." He was devastated, and in his grief he blamed Pierre's absent-mindedness, asking bitterly what his son had been dreaming about this time. No one could say with certainty what had caused the accident. Perhaps Pierre's umbrella blocked his view. Perhaps he slipped on the wet street. Perhaps illness and exhaustion had made him less steady than usual. Most likely, it was all of these things together. When Marie returned home around 6 o'clock that evening, she could tell immediately from the expressions of those around her that something awful had happened. Paul Appel explained the facts. Marie stood motionless, listening in silence. At first, she did not cry. She simply repeated the words as though she could not force herself to believe them. Pierre was dead? Dead? Completely dead? Even as the truth was spoken aloud, it still seemed impossible. The man who had been her husband, the father of her children, her closest friend, and her scientific partner was suddenly gone. The strain of facing everything at once was too much. Marie asked Madame Perrin to take care of Irène for a few days while baby Eve stayed at home in the care of others. Marie could not even bring herself to explain the truth to her older daughter. When she spoke to Irène across the fence, she said only that her father had hurt his head badly and needed rest. That same evening, friends brought Marie the few things found in Pierre's pockets: his keys, his watch, his pen, his wallet. She sent a brief telegram to her family in Poland, stating only that Pierre was dead in an accident. Then André Debierne retrieved Pierre's body from the police station and brought it back to the house. Alone with him, Marie kissed his face and refused to leave the room while his body was washed and dressed. When Pierre's brother Jacques arrived, the grief that she had held back finally broke open. She wept openly, and his presence gave her some comfort. Later, they reread Pierre's old letters and what remained of his journal, trying to hold on to whatever they could of him. News of Pierre's death spread quickly beyond France. In the United States, newspapers immediately reported that the discoverer of radium had been killed in a Paris street accident. Even in death, however, Marie was often described incorrectly as merely his assistant, rather than his equal partner. One report even got the facts wrong about their children. It was another sign of how difficult the world still found it to imagine a woman as a true scientific equal. For Marie, one of the main ways of surviving the shock was writing. She began a journal and addressed it directly to Pierre. In those pages, she spoke to him as if he were still there, trying to bridge the impossible silence that death had left behind. She wrote in the laboratory, where they had worked together, a place she had never imagined inhabiting without him. Her entries about the burial were especially painful. She described sitting beside the coffin covered in flowers, refusing to let it be draped in black cloth. She wrote of the grave in Sceaux and of her horror as Pierre's body disappeared into the earth. For her, it felt as if everything had come to an end. The journal also reveals that their marriage, though loving and profound, had not been without small tensions. She reproached him, even in memory, for working too hard and for spending too little time with the family. But those small complaints only deepened the loss. She also remembered their shared holidays, their walks, their bicycle rides, and the joy they had once found together. Again and again, memory would rise, and then crash into the truth that Pierre was gone forever. Friends and colleagues also mourned Pierre publicly. One of the most moving tributes came from Paul Langevin, who wrote of the cruel injustice that Pierre had died, just at the moment when life was finally beginning to open before him. At last, he was gaining recognition. At last, he had more freedom for laboratory work, and then all of it was cut short in a stupid street accident. After the first shock, practical questions began to arise. What would happen to Pierre's laboratory? What would happen to his research? What would become of his teaching at the Sorbonne? The government offered Marie a widow's pension, but she refused it immediately. She said she was still young enough to work and support herself and her daughters. Since she was too broken at first to think clearly about the future, family and friends took action for her. They argued that Marie was the only person in France truly qualified to continue Pierre's scientific work. Although no woman had ever held such a position before, the Faculty of Science agreed and offered her the chair that had been created for Pierre. In this way, Marie Curie became the first woman to teach at the Sorbonne. This was a historic moment, but it came at a terrible personal cost. Nearly a month after Pierre's death, Marie noted in her journal that she had officially been named his successor. Around that same time, she took another step in facing the reality of loss. One evening, she brought out the blood-stained clothes Pierre had been wearing when he died. With Bronia beside her, she began cutting them into pieces and throwing them into the fire. When fragments of his remains appeared among the fabric, she broke down again, kissing them in anguish, before Bronia finished the task. After that, Marie seems to have made a silent decision. She would go on. Not with joy, not with peace, but with duty. For the sake of her children and for the sake of science, she would continue. During the summer and autumn, she prepared to take over Pierre's course at the Sorbonne. She knew that all eyes would be on her. Many people were curious. Some wondered whether she would collapse in grief during the lecture. Others quietly hoped she would fail, proving that a woman had no place in such a position. Neither happened. When she entered the hall for her first lecture, hundreds of people had gathered. She was greeted with prolonged applause, but she did not give way to emotion. Instead, she began calmly and directly, picking up the course at the very sentence where Pierre had left off. The effect was overwhelming. Many listeners were moved to tears, not because she wept, but because she did not. The quiet dignity of that moment was stronger than any dramatic display. When the lecture ended, she left the hall quickly. Among those who remembered Pierre afterward, many spoke of his generosity and his gift for inspiring younger scientists. Paul Langevin recalled how much he had learned standing beside Pierre at the blackboard, speaking about ideas and research. Henri Poincaré remembered talking with him the night before his death and later lamented that such a great intelligence had been taken away in such a senseless accident. These tributes mattered deeply to Marie. They reminded her that Pierre hadn't only been brilliant, but beloved. Still, the Paris house felt unbearable. Every room carried his memory. Eventually, the family moved to a house in Sceaux, near where Pierre had grown up. Marie did not find it beautiful and once described it as a house without charm, but it met their practical needs. It gave Pierre's father a place to garden, and it gave the girls room to play outdoors. There, they built a simple little world around exercise and routine. Marie believed strongly that physical activity was an important part of education. She wanted her daughters to grow up strong, disciplined, and healthy. She encouraged gymnastics, swimming, bicycling, rowing, skating, skiing, and horseback riding. At the same time, she also wanted them to have an education that matched her own values, especially a serious grounding in science. To achieve this, she helped organize a small cooperative school for a group of children, including Irène. Parents and friends served as teachers. Henriette Perrin taught history and French. Others taught languages, geography, and natural science. Paul Langevin taught mathematics. Jean Perrin taught physics. Marie herself taught chemistry, using real laboratories rather than dry classroom lectures. Sometimes the children even went to museums instead of having ordinary lessons. This experiment lasted only 2 years, largely because the adults involved were too busy to continue it. In the end, the children would still have to pass official examinations, so they eventually had to return to more conventional schooling. Even so, the experiment showed the kind of education Marie believed in. Practical, serious, intellectually alive, and deeply rooted in science. Later, she went even further and tried to have Irène admitted to a boys' school, believing that boys in France still received a better education than girls. This caused an uproar. School officials refused, and some male teachers openly complained at the idea of teaching girls. Marie did not give up quietly, but in the end the request was denied. It was another reminder that even after the Nobel Prize, even after the Sorbonne, she still lived in a world deeply resistant to women and girls stepping into spaces reserved for men. Inside the home, however, the atmosphere remained heavy. Grandfather Eugène Curie helped keep sorrow from swallowing the household completely. While Marie tried to protect the girls from pain by never speaking Pierre's name, Eugène brought warmth, humour, and playfulness into their lives. He teased them, played with them, and made lessons in nature and botany joyful, especially for Irène. Eve later felt that her mother had made a mistake by trying so hard to hide grief. In avoiding open mourning, Marie also deprived herself and the girls of the comfort that can come from shared memory. She was often silent, sad, and demanding. Eugène, by contrast, gave the children a sense of lightness. In 1909, Eugène fell ill and was confined to bed for a long time. Marie spent much of her energy caring for him, trying to comfort and distract him. When he died in 1910, she arranged for his coffin to be placed in the same grave as Pierre's. Even in death, she wanted them to remain together. The daughters grew up with a good education, but the emotional atmosphere of the house affected them deeply. Irène, especially, became shy and withdrawn. She would hide when strangers visited and lower her head when spoken to. Eve later remembered the sadness of those years and the difficulty of living with such a silent, grieving mother. And yet both girls loved Marie deeply. They called her tender names and felt compassion for her, seeing in her face, in her eyes, and even in the way she rubbed her damaged fingers together, the pain she carried. Irène resembled her mother not only in character but also in interests. Eve was different, more open, more artistic, more drawn to writing and music. After Pierre's death, Marie Curie made a decision she would later regret. Out of loyalty to science and a belief that knowledge should belong to everyone, she gave away the radium that was personally hers. At first, this seemed like a noble and natural thing to do. But as time passed, she realized how valuable that material truly was, both scientifically and financially. Still, help came from an unexpected place. In Paris, shortly after Pierre's death, Marie met the American industrialist and philanthropist Andrew Carnegie. Carnegie was deeply impressed by her seriousness, her dignity, and her devotion to science. He decided to support her research financially. This gift was especially meaningful to Marie because it allowed her to build a team of young researchers around her and begin creating a true center for the study of radioactivity in Paris. She could accept this support with a clear conscience because she saw it not as money for herself, but as money for science and for the students she was guiding. By 1906, almost the entire scientific world had accepted that radium was indeed a new chemical element. But one very important man still refused to believe it. This was Lord Kelvin, one of the most famous and respected scientists in Britain. Kelvin had immense authority, and for many years his opinion carried enormous weight. Yet he simply could not bring himself to accept that radium was a truly new element. In August 1906, he made his case publicly in the Times of London, knowing perfectly well that anything involving radium fascinated the public. He argued that radium was not an element at all, but merely a compound made up of lead combined with helium. If he had been correct, then much of Marie Curie's work, and also the theory of radioactive change being developed by Rutherford and Soddy, would have been badly shaken. But Kelvin was an old man by then, and like many great scientists late in life, he found it difficult to abandon a deeply rooted way of thinking. Marie, however, was every bit as certain in her own position. Lord Kelvin's refusal challenged not only radium itself, but her larger conclusion that radioactivity was an atomic property. She decided that the best answer was not argument, but evidence. In her new laboratory, she began once again the long process of purification, determined to produce an even purer form of radium than before. By 1907, she had succeeded in preparing radium chloride of exceptional purity, which allowed her to calculate an even more precise atomic weight for radium. By that point, there was very little room left for doubt. Radium was a genuine element. Even then, Lord Kelvin and others of his generation still held on stubbornly to older ideas. The thought that one element could transform into another sounded far too much like alchemy for them to accept easily. Yet several distinguished scientists were now producing evidence that this kind of transformation was exactly what was happening. William Ramsay, Ernest Rutherford, and Frederick Soddy had all carried out work suggesting that atoms could break down and produce new substances. Marie Curie herself was cautious by nature, and she did not rush into endorsing every claim. At first she hesitated when Ramsay reported that copper might be changing into helium, but eventually she publicly stated that she agreed with the general line of thought put forward by Ramsay, Rutherford, and Soddy. She believed that radium belonged among a group of unstable elements whose atoms changed by themselves and produced helium as one of the results. Even then, she remained careful. She was not completely certain whether the helium came directly from the radium itself or from gases surrounding it. But she had no doubt that some kind of atomic transformation was taking place. What is striking is that Marie did not react with anger to those who disagreed with her. She did not treat scientific disagreement as a personal insult. On the contrary, she believed that only through open debate and the free exchange of ideas could science move forward. Because of that, she did not think it useful to fight Lord Kelvin publicly in a dramatic way. She simply continued her work, repeated her conclusion that radium was a distinct element, and allowed evidence to speak for itself. When Kelvin died in December 1907, much of the old resistance faded away. Around the same time, with the help of André Debienne, Marie also confirmed that polonium-2 was a distinct new element. Even outside the scientific world, radium had become an object of fascination. In 1908, newspapers were still trying to explain it to the public. One report in the New York Times admitted that radium had almost no practical commercial use yet, but that laboratories wanted it desperately because of its scientific importance. The price mentioned was so astonishing that it almost sounded absurd. The journalist was still unsure whether radium should be thought of as a material thing, or more like a mysterious force. To speak of a pound of it, he said, felt almost like speaking of a pound of sunlight. That sense of wonder reflected how strange radium still seemed. Every day, new experiments were being performed in Marie Curie's laboratory, and yet the deeper secret of radium remained unsolved. Articles like these, along with the lingering doubts of some older scientists, pushed Marie to work even harder. By September 1910, she achieved something remarkable. She announced to the French Academy of Sciences that she had finally isolated pure metallic radium. Until then, radium had existed only in the form of salts. Now, through an electrolytic process, she succeeded in separating the metal itself. Reports described it as a white metal that clung strongly to iron, darkened in air, reacted in water, and could even burn paper. For Marie, this was not just another technical success. It was a decisive answer to those who had questioned the very existence of radium as an element. The next major challenge for Marie and her laboratory was to help establish an international standard for radium. This was becoming increasingly important. Scientists working in different countries needed to know how pure their samples were if they wanted their results to be comparable. Doctors, too, needed reliable standards because radium was now being used in attempts to treat cancer. A hospital could not know the right dose if it did not know the strength and purity of the substance it was using. Although national pride and scientific rivalry complicated the matter, there was also general agreement on one point. Marie Curie was the person best qualified to prepare the standard. In 1911, she established that standard and placed a sealed glass tube containing pure radium salt at the International Bureau of Weights and Measures near Paris. This act gave the scientific world a common reference point and greatly increased her authority. But while her scientific influence was rising, her relations with some colleagues were becoming more strained. Marie could be demanding, firm, and difficult to persuade. At international meetings, she often appeared inflexible. Younger researchers in her laboratory usually adored her and were inspired by her seriousness and commitment. But people who did not know her well sometimes found her cold or distant. They did not always understand that what looked like pride or contempt often came from shyness, reserve, and emotional sensitivity. Some of the people she offended would later become active enemies. One of the most troublesome was an American chemist named Bertram Boltwood. He was a talented radiochemist, admired by Rutherford, but also unstable in mood and sometimes bitter. Boltwood once asked Marie for permission to compare one of his radium solutions with her radium standard. She refused. To him, this seemed selfish and controlling, and he complained to Rutherford that Marie simply did not want to do anything that might help scientists outside her own laboratory. Rutherford, who usually handled such matters more diplomatically, later managed to persuade her to lend him the standard when he needed it. Even though he remained supportive of her in public, he gradually grew less impressed by her scientific originality. He, like Boltwood, increasingly thought that her strength lay more in persistence, discipline, and hard work than in bold imagination. Around this time, Marie published a major summary of advances in radiation, her treatise on radioactivity. Rutherford reviewed it favourably in public, but privately he could be condescending. By then, her health was clearly declining, and she often missed meetings because she was unwell. Some of her less sympathetic colleagues began to accuse her of pretending illness whenever a discussion did not go the way she wanted. One dispute involved the naming of the measurement unit for radium. At one meeting, there was disagreement about how the unit should be defined and whether it should bear the Curie name. When the discussion turned against her, Marie left, saying she was ill. Later, she sent a note insisting that if the name Curie was going to be used, then she must be the one to define it. In the end, she won that fight, but not without making more enemies. Even Rutherford, who generally respected her, found her difficult to work with at times. In 1910, he approached her about the confusion caused by different radium standards being used in different laboratories. There was one in her lab, another in Vienna, and others elsewhere. Everyone agreed that a common international standard was needed. Marie accepted that she should prepare it, but she also wanted to keep it in her own laboratory for a while, partly for practical reasons, and partly for emotional ones. This was a change from the idealism she and Pierre had shown earlier, when they believed radium belonged to humanity, and not to any one person or nation. Rutherford had to negotiate carefully to convince her that no single scientist could keep permanent control of the international standard. In the end, the problem was settled by comparing Marie's standard with one from Vienna. Fortunately, the two agreed closely, and a larger conflict was avoided. Then, 5 years after Pierre's death, another part of Marie's life began to shift in a direction that would soon explode into public scandal. One day, Marguerite Borel noticed Marie entering the dining room wearing a white dress with a rose at her waist. To anyone else, this might have seemed a small detail. But to those who knew Marie well, it was striking. Since Pierre's death, she had worn dark clothing and lived as a woman still in mourning. Marguerite immediately sensed that something had changed. She suspected that Marie's heart was no longer buried in grief alone. The man at the centre of this change was Paul Langevin. He had once been Pierre's student and had become a respected physicist in his own right. He was brilliant, intense, and deeply unhappy in his marriage. Marguerite Borel, who was a natural listener and not entirely immune to gossip, had become a confidant both for Langevin and for Marie. Langevin spoke to her of his miserable home life. Marie, too, criticised his wife Jeanne, whom she saw as unsympathetic to Paul's intellectual needs. Gradually, those close to them began to suspect that a romance was developing. By this time, the conditions for public scandal were stronger than ever. Newspapers had grown more powerful and more sensational. New printing technology, faster communication, and the rise of science journalism meant that famous scientists were no longer hidden from the public. The press had become hungry, not just for discoveries, but for personalities, private lives, and scandal. Marie Curie, by then one of the most famous women in the world, was a perfect target. At the same time, she made another controversial decision. She chose to stand as a candidate for election to the French Academy of Sciences. This was bold. Pierre had had painful experiences with that institution, and no woman had ever been elected to it. But Marie understood the practical value of such a position. It would mean more prestige, more support for her laboratory, and more influence in French science. She wanted that recognition, both for herself and for her work, so she swallowed her pride and made the required visits to Academy members. The response was immediate and explosive. At first, some newspapers praised her and presented her as the noble widow who had endured sorrow and continued her scientific mission. But others were hostile from the beginning. Many of her colleagues had never fully liked her. They found her cold, proud, and too certain of herself. While they might have tolerated a modest, feminine woman, they were less willing to accept an ambitious and opinionated one. The idea that a woman might enter the academy turned into a national argument. Some newspapers treated it as a serious issue. Others turned it into a spectacle. One called it a battle of the sexes. The political divisions behind the debate made it even uglier. Liberals, anti-clericals, and supporters of women's rights tended to support Marie. Nationalists, conservatives, and the far right lined up behind her opponent, the older scientist Edouard Branly. The right-wing press attacked Marie viciously. They mocked her as a foreigner, brought up her Polish origins, and even hinted, without evidence, that she had Jewish roots. In this atmosphere, her scientific qualifications became almost secondary. The election became a cultural struggle over nationalism, gender, religion, and social order. When the vote finally took place in January 1911, it was extremely close. Marie lost by only a narrow margin. Her disappointment was severe, and she never again sought election to the Academy. The whole affair left her wounded and exposed. Then came the scandal that would overshadow even that defeat. In the spring of 1911, while Marie was in Brussels attending the Solvay conference, a meeting of many of the greatest scientific minds in Europe, matters in Paris reached a breaking point. Some private letters between her and Paul Langevin had been stolen after someone broke into his study. These letters suggested a close emotional relationship. For months, nothing publicly happened. Perhaps Jean Langevin still hoped her marriage could be saved. But the marriage itself was breaking down badly. After one bitter conflict, Paul even left the family home with the children. Jean, furious and desperate, eventually turned to the press. A Paris newspaper launched the scandal with a front-page story about a love affair between Marie Curie and Paul Langevin. Jean was presented as the wronged wife and mother. Marie was painted as a cold, ambitious woman of science who had taken another woman's husband and threatened the happiness of a French family. The attack was not only personal, but symbolic. She was portrayed as the dangerous modern woman, foreign, intellectual, independent, and unfeminine. At first, supporters tried to dismiss the story as the jealousy of a wounded wife. Marie herself wrote a sharp public denial, condemning the press for invading her private life. She insisted that she had nothing to be ashamed of and threatened legal action. For a moment, it seemed possible that the matter might fade. But the scandal returned with even more force when, later that same year, Marie was considered for a second Nobel Prize, this time in chemistry. The timing could not have been worse. The Nobel Committee wanted to honour her for isolating radium in pure metallic form and for her larger work on the chemistry of radioactive substances. But the Swedish Academy was uneasy about the rumours swirling around her. At first, it was reassured by denials from Marie and by attempts to soften the public accusations. In November 1911, the Academy voted to award her the prize. Yet the atmosphere in the press was completely different from what it had been in 1903. This time, instead of celebrating her, many newspapers barely mentioned the scientific achievement at all. Meanwhile, Jeanne Langevin escalated matters further. She threatened blackmail. If Paul did not surrender custody of the children and give her a monthly payment, she would release the letters publicly. When he refused, she filed charges against him and prepared for a public fight. Newspapers on the far right now attacked Marie more openly than ever. Some denounced her as a foreign intruder, others as a destroyer of families, and still others as a symbol of everything they disliked in modern society. Soon, one paper published extracts from the letters themselves. Even though the passages were not explicit, they were enough to convince most readers that the relationship was real. The public reaction was fierce. Crowds gathered outside Marie's house, shouting insults. The scene became so threatening that friends had to rescue her and her daughters. She and Eve were taken away quickly, while Irene, old enough to understand what was happening, had already seen the hateful newspaper stories. When she reached her mother, she clung to her in silence, both of them stunned. Eve, still much younger, did not fully understand. Marie herself, who had endured years of scientific hostility and personal grief, now found herself at the centre of a full public humiliation. Duels even broke out in defence of her name and in attacks against Langevin. Journalists and supporters challenged one another with swords and pistols, and newspapers reported these events in dramatic detail. One of the most famous duels involved Langevin himself. He felt compelled to defend his honour after being insulted in print. The duel ended without a fatal shot, but the entire affair added another layer of absurdity and violence to a scandal that had already turned into public theatre. Even in Sweden, members of the Nobel establishment became nervous. One of Marie's earlier supporters, Svante Arrhenius, now suggested that perhaps she should not come in person to receive the prize. Marie answered firmly. She insisted that her scientific work had nothing to do with her private life, and that slander and gossip should have no bearing on the judgment of her research. In this, she was absolutely uncompromising. Her personal life, whatever people thought of it, did not change the reality of her discoveries. Langevin eventually chose not to fight the case all the way through in public. He accepted a settlement. Jeanne received custody of the children, though he kept some rights to see them and influence their education. Ironically, many years later, a grandchild of Marie Curie and a grandchild of Paul Langevin would marry, long after the scandal itself had faded into history. The affair drew attention far beyond France. Newspapers in the United States followed every detail, including the duels, the accusations, and the court proceedings. Some American coverage was more sympathetic than the French press. Certain editorials argued that even if the accusations were true, they did not diminish Marie Curie's greatness as a scientist. Some writers suggested that extraordinary people often lived by different emotional rules than ordinary society expected. Others saw clear signs that the scandal was being deliberately used to destroy her. But for Marie herself, the personal cost was immense. At first, she tried to stand straight, hold her head high, and pretend that the attacks did not affect her. Yet, as the scandal spread across countries and newspapers, even her strong self-control began to crack. She became afraid of facing people. Every public appearance now carried the risk of humiliation. At the very moment when she should have been enjoying one of the greatest triumphs of her life, a second Nobel Prize, she instead found herself trapped in a nightmare of gossip, hatred, and isolation. In the middle of the storm created by the scandal, Marie Curie made a remarkable decision. Instead of hiding, she travelled to Stockholm with her sister Bronia and her daughter Irene to attend the Nobel Prize ceremony. Despite everything that had happened, she stood before the scientific world with calm dignity. From the outside, no one could see the emotional weight she was carrying. Facing an audience that still had doubts about her, she began her speech with quiet confidence. She spoke about how radioactivity had first been discovered by Henri Becquerel, and how she had expanded that research, later joined by Pierre. She explained how this work led to the discovery of new elements whose radiation was far more powerful than uranium. She also reminded the audience that she had introduced the term radioactivity to describe this entirely new property of matter. As she continued, she emphasized that isolating radium, her greatest achievement, was the foundation of the entire science of radioactivity. Radium, she said, had become the most powerful and useful tool in laboratories studying this phenomenon. Because of this, she expressed her gratitude to the Swedish Academy for awarding her the Nobel Prize in Chemistry. Interestingly, in this speech, she spoke more often in the first person than usual, clearly asserting her own role in these discoveries, while still giving credit to other scientists. Outwardly, the audience listened respectfully, and there was no visible sign that the scandal had affected their reception of her work. But physically, Marie was reaching her limits. Just 18 days after her lecture, she collapsed and had to be taken to a hospital. She was seriously ill with a severe kidney condition. Many of her close friends believed that the emotional strain of the scandal had played a major role in her breakdown. Doctors diagnosed an infection in her kidney and ureter, likely caused by earlier damage. They considered surgery, but at first chose to wait. During January 1912, she was cared for by a religious order, and although her condition improved slightly, she remained weak. She returned home and reunited with Irene and Eve, but she was far from recovered. Even in this fragile state, Marie pushed herself back into her work by early March. When surgery finally became unavoidable later that month, she was extremely weak. Although the operation itself was successful, her recovery was long and painful. The months that followed were among the darkest in her life. Physically exhausted and emotionally drained, she fell into a deep depression. At times, her friends feared she might take her own life. She believed she might die and began making arrangements for her affairs, even deciding what should happen to her precious radium. Her weight dropped dramatically, and she moved from one recovery center to another, often separated from her daughters. At the same time, she felt a crushing sense of shame. She believed she had dishonored the Curie name. To protect herself and her children, she kept her location secret, sharing it only with close family and a few trusted friends. Yet even in this painful period, her disciplined habits remained. She continued to write down everyday details, expenses, lessons, clothing for her daughters, as if trying to maintain some order in a life that felt out of control. Despite the hostility in the press, many people came to support her. Her siblings travelled to France to be by her side, and even those who might have judged her harshly, like Pierre's brother Jacques, defended her strongly. Her sister Bronia rented a small house outside Paris, where Marie could recover in privacy. But her health continued to fluctuate. In June, she suffered another relapse and had to move to a mountain sanatorium in Savoy. For her daughter Irene, this period was especially painful. She was caught between childhood and adulthood, and seeing her mother suffer was deeply distressing. At one point, Marie even told her not to use the name Curie in letters, but to write Madame Sklodowska. This hurt Irene deeply. During this time, Marie found comfort in an old friendship. Years earlier, she had met another remarkable woman scientist, Hertha Ayrton. The two had very different personalities. Marie was quiet and reserved, while Ayrton was confident and outspoken, but they shared similar struggles. Both had faced obstacles as women in science. Both had worked alongside scientist husbands, and both had fought for their place in a male-dominated world. Hertha Ayrton invited Marie to England, offering her a chance to rest away from the scandal. She arranged a quiet stay by the sea, far from the press. The trip helped Marie recover some of her strength. Although she still suffered physically, the peaceful environment and Ayrton's support allowed her to begin healing. By October 1912, she was strong enough to return to France. Once back in Paris, Marie quickly returned to the scientific world. Her energy for work had not disappeared. She became involved again in debates over radium research, even expressing frustration at other scientists who she felt were unfairly claiming credit. At the same time, a major concern was resolved. The international radium standards she had created were tested against others, and fortunately, they matched perfectly. This avoided a serious scientific conflict. By the end of 1912, Marie was back in her laboratory. The scandal had faded, and to Irene's relief, she once again used the name Curie. However, during the years she had been struggling, science had moved forward. New ideas about the atom, including Rutherford's nuclear model and Niels Bohr's theories, were transforming physics. Marie followed these developments closely and accepted many of them, even though her own research during this time did not lead to major new discoveries. Her work became more focused on radiochemistry rather than groundbreaking theory. By 1913, her life began to stabilize. She attended scientific conferences, traveled to Warsaw to open a radium institute built in her honor, and received recognition in England. She also began to reconnect socially. She hosted Albert Einstein and his wife for a long visit, and they developed a warm friendship. They even planned a hiking trip together in the Swiss Alps, along with their children. Despite Einstein's occasional private criticisms of her personality, he clearly respected her. Then, just as life seemed to be returning to normal, Europe was plunged into war. In 1914, Marie had just completed a new laboratory building dedicated to radioactivity. But instead of becoming a center for research, it was immediately overshadowed by the outbreak of World War I. Scientists and students were called to the front, leaving her almost alone. Paris itself was under threat, and many people fled the city. Marie faced a difficult decision. She had to protect both her daughters and her most valuable possession, her radium. She sent Irene and Eve to the coast for safety while she remained in Paris. Then, carrying a heavy container of radium herself, she transported it by train to Bordeaux, where the French government had relocated. Once it was secured, she returned to Paris, determined to do what she could. As the war intensified, Marie looked for a way to help. She realized that X-rays could be used to locate bullets and shrapnel inside wounded soldiers, greatly improving their chances of survival. Although she had not worked directly with X-rays before, she understood their principles. She decided to organize mobile radiology units that could be brought close to the battlefield. This idea faced resistance at first. Many military doctors did not believe radiology was necessary. But Marie persisted. She gathered equipment, raised funds, trained volunteers, and created mobile units, cars equipped with X-ray machines powered by their own engines. These vehicles became known as Little Curies. They brought modern medical imaging directly to wounded soldiers. Over time, she established around 200 radiology centers and equipped numerous mobile units. She also trained women to operate the machines, since men were needed at the front. This was revolutionary. Many of these women had little formal education, yet under Marie's guidance, they became skilled technicians. Her daughter Irene eventually joined her. At just 17, she began working in radiology, helping treat wounded soldiers. The experience was harsh and traumatic, but it shaped her future as a scientist. Marie herself worked tirelessly, often handling every detail personally. She transported equipment, negotiated with officials, trained staff, and even wrote a book explaining how radiology could be used in war. At the same time, she used radium in medical treatments, developing techniques to use its emissions safely. When the war finally ended in 1918, the cost had been enormous. Millions were dead or wounded. Yet Marie believed that her work had saved many lives. She saw in this experience a powerful truth, that pure science, even when developed for curiosity, could have profound practical benefits. After the war, Europe was changed forever. New countries were created, old empires collapsed, and tensions remained. But for Marie, there was at least one deeply personal satisfaction. Her homeland Poland was once again an independent nation. Despite everything she had endured, scandal, illness, war, Marie Curie continued to look forward. She focused on rebuilding her institute and training the next generation of scientists. Even as she worried about her age and her strength, she remained committed to one goal: to create a lasting centre of knowledge that would honour Pierre's memory and serve humanity. After the war ended, Marie Curie realised that many of her deepest hopes had finally come true. France was stable again, allowing her to return to her scientific work, and her homeland Poland had regained its independence after years of foreign control. In those early post-war days, people filled the streets celebrating, singing the national anthem and welcoming peace with overwhelming joy. But for Marie, the end of the war meant something much simpler. She could finally go back to her laboratory. Before returning fully to her work, she took a short but much-needed break by the sea. When she came back, she felt refreshed and ready to begin again. Her laboratory, however, was still very basic. Marie herself did not mind working in simple conditions, but she wanted something better for the young scientists who would come after her. If she was going to build a true centre for the study of radioactivity, she needed modern equipment, and more importantly, she needed more radium. Getting funding proved extremely difficult. Government institutions offered little support, and her requests were repeatedly denied. But Marie understood something important. There was one word that could open doors: cancer. Her reputation had grown worldwide because people believed her work could help fight this deadly disease. And at that time, the United States, which had emerged strong after the war, was becoming a global leader. In 1920, American women had gained the right to vote, and this new energy would soon play a major role in Marie's life. An American journalist named Marie Melanie, known as Missy, was determined to meet Curie. Many reporters had tried before and failed, as Marie avoided the press after her painful experiences with scandal. But Missy did not give up. She travelled to Paris herself and carefully wrote a letter that finally convinced Marie to grant her a short interview. When they met, something unexpected happened. Missy, who was used to interviewing powerful people, suddenly felt nervous. It was Marie who calmed her. During their conversation, they spoke about radium. Marie explained that the United States had about 50 grams of radium, while France had only 1. When Missy asked how much radium Marie personally owned, she answered simply, none. The gram in her laboratory did not belong to her, but to science. Missy was shocked. She suggested that Marie could have made a fortune through patents and royalties. But Marie refused the idea completely. She believed that radium was not something to be owned. It belonged to everyone. When Missy asked what she truly needed, Marie answered without hesitation: 1 gram of radium. That single gram, however, cost an enormous amount, about $100,000. Missy immediately decided she would raise the money. The two women formed a powerful bond. They were very different. Missy was outgoing and energetic, while Marie was reserved and private. But they shared a common goal. Missy believed she could gather donations from wealthy American women, and she set out to do exactly that. At first, Marie was hesitant to travel to the United States. She feared the press and worried that old scandals would resurface. but Missy assured her that this would not happen. She personally spoke to newspaper editors and asked for their cooperation. Slowly, Marie agreed. In 1921, Marie Curie travelled to America with her daughters Irene and Eve. By the time she arrived, the campaign had gained enormous attention. Newspapers followed every detail. Donations poured in, especially as reports emphasized the growing threat of cancer. Many people believed that radium might offer hope against the disease. When Marie arrived in New York, she was overwhelmed. Crowds gathered everywhere: students, scientists, journalists, and ordinary people. Flags from America, France, and Poland were raised in her honor. She had never experienced anything like it. But the attention was exhausting. Marie was not a public figure by nature. She preferred quiet work in her laboratory. Still, she attended ceremonies, received honorary degrees, and met countless people. Her daughters reacted differently. Irene found the attention uncomfortable, while Eve enjoyed it. The most important moment came at the White House. President Warren Harding personally presented her with a gram of radium, symbolizing the success of the campaign. Marie accepted it with gratitude, speaking in simple English, and expressing her commitment to using it for the benefit of humanity. Despite the success, the trip took a heavy toll on her health. She became increasingly weak and had to cancel many events. By the end of the visit, she was exhausted. Yet she also felt deeply moved. She described America as one of her 3 homes: the land of her birth, the land where she lived, and now the land of her friends. When she returned to France, her reputation had changed. The country that had once criticized her now celebrated her. She continued her work, building up the Radium Institute into a major center of research. Scientists from all over the world came to work there, creating a truly international environment. However, as time passed, the dangers of radiation became clearer. Marie had long believed in the benefits of radium, but evidence began to show its harmful effects. Workers exposed to radiation suffered burns, illness, and even death. Cases like the factory workers in the United States, who developed severe diseases after handling radium, shocked the scientific world. Even then, Marie struggled to accept that her discovery could be dangerous. She had devoted her life to it. Yet eventually, she began to recognize the risks. By the mid-1920s, she was involved in studies examining the health effects of radiation. Meanwhile, her personal life continued to evolve. Her daughter Irene married Frédéric Joliot, a talented young scientist. Together, they formed a partnership similar to that of Marie and Pierre. In time, they would win their own Nobel Prize, continuing the family's scientific legacy. As Marie grew older, her health steadily declined. Years of exposure to radiation had taken a toll on her body. She suffered from cataracts, weakness, and constant fatigue. Still, she refused to stop working. Even when she could barely stand, she continued to guide her laboratory and support young scientists. By the early 1930s, it became clear that her condition was serious. She experienced increasing pain, fever, and exhaustion. Yet she remained determined, even planning projects and organizing her affairs. In 1934, her health finally collapsed. She was taken to a sanatorium where doctors discovered that her bone marrow had been severely damaged. Her body could no longer produce blood cells. This condition, caused by years of radiation exposure, was fatal. On July 4, 1934, Marie Curie passed away. The world mourned her deeply. Scientists who had once criticized her now praised her achievements. Albert Einstein called her one of the most remarkable scientists of her time. Others described her as a pioneer who changed the way humanity understood matter and energy. She was buried in a simple ceremony, just as she would have wanted. No speeches, no grand display, only close friends, family, and fellow scientists placing roses on her coffin. Years later, in 1995, her remains were moved to the Pantheon in Paris, where she became the first woman honoured there for her own achievements. Marie Curie's life was a story of determination, sacrifice and discovery. She changed science forever and paid the ultimate price for it.